So, thank you so much for being here for the release of the National Colloquium Report, an inventory and evaluation of shelter and services for domestic minor sex trafficking victims. As you can see, it's a very comprehensive report. Over 100 individuals across the country contributed to this report. And one thing we really find important about it, we want it to be used as a tool. So I'd like to just briefly guide you through it because I think it can be a little overwhelming when you see how big of a report it is. Page 3 is a very important page in this report. It's your table of contents. The report itself only makes up about a third of the pages. Another huge piece is our survey responses. So we were able to do an inventory and evaluation of over 40 service providers across the country and over 30 survivors. They gave unbelievably great responses to say, here's what we're doing for safety and security. Here's what we're doing for licensing. So we actually gave a version of their extended answers in the back of the report so you can actually see and read firsthand from these providers and survivors. So we just want to make sure that you're able to look through it, use it well. The whole report is available on the ECPAT website and on the Shared Hope website for distribution. But again, the most important part is that we want this report to be a tool for everybody. And to tell you a little bit more about the report and to officially welcome you, I'd like to introduce somebody who is no stranger to the Hill, the president of Shared Hope International, Congresswoman Linda Smith.
Well, first, I want to thank Senator Portman, Senator Blumenthal, co-chairs of the Senate Caucus to End Human Trafficking, and Judge Ted Poe and Representative Jim Costa, co-chairs the Congressional Caucus for Victims' Rights. But thanks are also due to a caucus I used to be involved in, the Women's Caucus of the House, and Representative Jamie Herrera Butler and Donna F. Edwards are co-chairs. We thank them, and Representative Christy Noem and Doris Matsui, vice chairs. And by the way, the staff of both of those caucuses, you that are here, I know how much work something like this is, even to support your members in, so thanks to you. Every year, over 100,000 children in the United States are victimized and tormented by commercial sex trade, and they're forced into prostitution where they experience unthinkable cruelties. As I was thinking about this morning, I went back a ways, and I started thinking 15 years back. And 15 years ago, Shared Hope started working with the survivors of sex trafficking. What we found around the world is what we found in the United States, and what is so important about this study is those 15 years say something. They say the survivors that we work with, and we have them throughout our network of services we partner with and run around the world in the United States, we found that the survivors have gone through horrible, horrible things. But we also find an amazing resiliency when they have the right kind of long-term support, shelter, and services that acknowledge them as distinctively a different kind of a survivor of a violent crime, one unlike anything other. Victims of horrible things that most of us would never understand and never want to go through, and a few of these you in the room have, but most of us have not. About 2005, 2006, we started looking at America intensely as organizations. Johns Hopkins University, who's here co-sponsoring this report, ECPAT International, and many of you in the room. And we started addressing this issue, both from a policy and justice issue. But we all knew one thing. That was we needed those same kind of services that many of us were involved in around the world, who were helping these amazingly resilient women and sometimes boys to recover. And so we started on a path. We, you in the room, the organizations bringing this to you today, and many others that are out watching who have been a part of this colloquium preparation. And we've today come to some research. We came together to draw a base of knowledge. And that base of knowledge is what we're working from now. The Colloquium started last year in July with a group of experts, some of you listening in, some of you in the room. I see Melissa in the back. I see, oh, you changed positions. I started to say Blair's in the front. You're not that anymore. You're with the State Department. Kathleen, right? Catherine. I did mess it all up. She's going to get married and have a different last name here soon anyway. So. But as I watched this over this last year, and I watched the knowledge come together, it started to gel. There were certain principles, a certain framework that needed to be there for these amazingly resilient women and children that are victims of this violent crime. So we bring to you today what we call the Colloquium Report. But it's many people's mind, experience, and practice as they come together in policy, service, and determination, and I'll say passion, to help these women and children around the United States. So the Colloquium Report is what we have for today. I call them guiding principles, our knowledge, the best we can do and offer to the nation to build a foundation that gives us standards and a framework of service for these kids. I'll be leaving on another trip. I live on a plane most of my life. I'll be traveling around the world, back to some of the first girls. Dr. Mohammed Matar in the front went to a wedding of one of our girls many years ago together as we saw her both restored and married in a white dress in a beautiful program. I call the program because they have millions of people and they give all kinds of gifts in India. I'll be going back to see her, but also her baby, her husband, the village where each day young women come and she teaches them and models for them what can happen when there are long-term restoration and services, compassion and determination, that what happens to you is not who you are. So as I come back home in about a month or so from now, and I start working in America again, I will be dreaming and working with the rest of you to have those marriages, those college graduations, and all those things that are happening to women around the world that many of us started with 10, 15 years ago. And now we want for all of the women and children in America. So I want to welcome you all to this Colloquium Report. I want to acknowledge Eliza Rioch for her great work on this and organizing it on our staff. And you from the other organizations that I might not know your name. I want to thank you, Eliza, for this great work. And then I will commend it to the experts that you will see today. And just say, most of us don't like to be called experts because we still believe we're learning. And this time next year we'll have learned a lot more. May God bless you all, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Linda, and for your leadership. We are so happy to bring this Colloquium Report and release it today here at the Capitol, especially because of the relation and the impact we hope it has in the newly and more burgeoning federal advocacy around this issue. We really appreciate today the leadership in the room, including, of course, Joy Frost, who is joining us here from OVC. And then we also have Catherine Chan in the room. Catherine is the Senior Advisor to the Acting Assistant Secretary George Sheldon at the Administrations of Children and Family. She's going to be saying a few words about the recently released Federal Strategic Action Plan.
Thank you for that introduction, Eliza. And here on behalf of Assistant Secretary George Sheldon, he had the privilege of being with you last November when you actually held the National Colloquium. And from then on, we learned so much from that one event. And so we're so excited to see this report. So very big congratulations to Shared Hope and Protection Project and EdPat for gathering the wisdom of the field, because you're right, we always have so much to learn no matter how long we've been working on this issue. And just to touch on, many of you in the room and on the live stream know that across the federal government, we've been working together since last year to come up with a 5-year federal strategic action plan on victim services, covering victims of all forms of trafficking, including domestic sex trafficking minors. And I'm happy to be here on the behalf of our co-chairs, including the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and all our federal partners. And as you know, we released the draft report for public comments in April. The public comment period closed in May, and know that we are meeting on a weekly and regular basis across the federal government, reviewing about more than 1,400 public comments that have come in from across the country. So thank you so much for your ongoing engagement, and we look forward to releasing the final 5-year strategic action plan in coming months to be announced. And one of the things that strikes me about this report is the degree to which there was an overlap and reinforcement of many of the public comments that came in. So some of the common themes: yes, we definitely as a country need to focus on serving all forms of trafficking, but there are very specific needs that child and youth victims of trafficking have. And yes, we need to do much more on engaging survivors, empowering survivors, whether it's work and policymaking that's happening at the federal government, or things we could be doing with non-government organizations and community-based organizations across the country. There was another big emphasis on the importance of partnerships with, again, service providers, law enforcement, faith-based organizations, and we heard that loud and clear. The importance of prevention, and so although the strategic action plan mostly focuses on victim identification and victim services, we can't ignore prevention. That came out loud and clear. And then many other themes, including the diversity of needs, the importance on having effective housing and aftercare programs that are trauma-informed, and we'll give more of a readout of this when the final plan comes out, but we just wanted to share that the themes that we've heard across the country at all levels overlapped a lot with what we found in the report. But the report, it was really helpful for us to see the very specific guidance and experiences from the field. So we definitely encourage wide readership of the resource that's being announced today. And then one other note that I would want to make, at least from the Administration for Children and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services, is that we are definitely focused a lot in part of our work on child trafficking. And so recently, the Runaway Homeless Youth Grant Programming wove in pieces on trafficking so that more victims could be served within that particular slice of the community. We're still working on soon to be released guidance on child trafficking for child welfare systems and runaway homeless youth programs. And then if you, for those at least in the room today, there's a briefing sheet that we distributed at last month's congressional briefing or forum on the intersection between child welfare and child trafficking on 10 emerging practices. So we highly recommend for you to check that out. It'll be posted on our website as well. And so those are just a few opening remarks on to give you a sense that the federal government is here, and we encourage continued engagement. So thank you so much for releasing this report, and congratulations to everyone in the room and on the live stream.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Again, we're so appreciative of the federal leadership we've seen around this issue. And to speak a little bit more about how the Colloquium report has a nexus within federal strategy, I'd like to introduce Carol Smolensky, Executive Director of ECPAT USA. I just have to say, Carol spent so many late nights with us on the phone, keeping this report true to form. And so we thank you so much for all your leadership.
Thank you, Liza. It was fun. What, you know, what can I say? Welcome everybody. It's a delight to be here at the launch of this really amazing report. I think that Eliza and the Shared Hope staff really are the ones who made sure it happened and got out the door. So congratulations to them. And it's been a delight to work with Dr. Motar at the Protection Project and everyone at Shared Hope. It's my job to do a few things in a very few number of minutes. So forgive me if I talk a little too fast. I want to try to move through a lot of things, talking about what's important in the report, very briefly touching on the summary of recommendations, and then what it means for federal legislation and policy. The report provides policymakers, government agencies, service providers, and law enforcement with an overview of current services and shelter delivery models. Really important point in our movement to protect children from child trafficking for this to have taken place. The recommendations from the report, I think, should be used as a framework for creating and establishing shelters and services for victims, because it brings together really where we are in the field. But as Vanita Carter, Executive Director of Breaking Free in Minneapolis and a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation herself, said, it is not inaccurate to say that one role of the federal government is to prioritize issues, to make decisions on behalf of the nation, and to act broadly in creating better policies and effecting systems change. She goes on to say the federal government cannot and should not, though, shoulder the burden alone. We know that due to the nature of the crime of commercial sexual exploitation of children, that multiple systems interact with child victims, and collaboration is critical among law enforcement, child welfare agencies, and other first responders. The report shows that practitioners providing direct services reported they received referrals from juvenile probation, child protective services, and law enforcement, and that 84% of them can receive family or self-identified referrals. So they're coming from many different directions. It also shows, the report really shows the growth we're seeing in the field and why continued research and support is so critical. Until this report, a common statement was that there are under 100 beds in the United States for the protection of child trafficking victims. That was sort of just the accepted wisdom. Since this report, the new number that you should all now be using is that service providers, at least those that responded to the survey, have the capacity to serve 226 minor victims and survivors. And in response to the survey, at the time that they took the survey, they were actually serving 168 young people. But the survey also identified that there are community-based services available to 1,684 individuals through these service providers that took the survey, and that they were actually providing services to 1,063 at the time they answered the questionnaire. So 226 beds, that's going to be at least 226 beds. That's going to be your answer from now on when you get asked how many, It does, these numbers, although a little bit misleading because it implies that, oh, there's plenty of capacity because not even all the beds are filled. But it's really important for you to read the report because it shows the mismatch between the geography of where the sexually exploited kids are being identified and where the services are, what the actual needs are for the kids, and the lack of a coordinated referral response, and the mismatch between the funding stream and where the services are. So it really is important for you to still read the report, I think, to really understand that. Let me just say quickly, the report was the result of a several months long planning process with many service providers from around the country being consulted. A day-long consultation that I know many of you were at or maybe watched live streamed back in November. And then 3 national surveys were distributed for providers, survivors, and advocates and funders. And over 100 expert individuals and organizations completed the survey. The report includes 26 specific recommendations in these categories: placement and services for identified youth, licensing and maintaining shelter and programs, identifying sustainable resources, programmatic therapeutic responses, and the fifth one, safety and security recommendations. So just quickly, under placement and services for identified youth, respondents agree that there's no uniform method of treatment that's applicable to every victim of child sex trafficking. Individual needs and desires of victims and survivors should dictate placements, and multiple options must be made available from congregate care and specialized foster care to community-based support and services. Services must be trauma-informed and victim-centered. Two types of residential placements exist: emergency care and long-term care, and training is essential. First responders, law enforcement, social workers, therapists, and others must all be trained to identify and respond to domestic minor sex trafficking victims in a trauma-informed and victim-centered manner. Licensing. Licenses must be available for all types of care facilities, and what we need are laws that mandate, establish, and financially support residential and community-based programs providing treatment across a continuum of care. Both licensing agencies and providers have to analyze the barriers that exist to obtaining the correct licensing and work together to overcome these, but licensing really is critical. Third category, identifying sustainable resources. Lack of adequate funding remains a significant challenge. Programs can be costly, with some facilities estimating that the cost per child in a residential facility ranges from $24,000 to $50,000, although it's important to note that not all young people are in need of the full array of services at all times. Respondents identified the following government funding sources. At the state and local levels, state child welfare agencies, county juvenile probation, city runaway and homeless youth funding, state governor's offices. At the federal level, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, Runaway and Homeless Youth Departments, Office of Violence Against Women, Office of Victims of Crime, Office on Violence Against Women, and the Victims Crime Act all provide resources. Challenges to government funding include jurisdictional issues, such as children that are found in one state but identified to be in the custody of another state, that funding does not necessarily follow that child to the state where the child is identified. Per diem funding mechanisms are also challenging, as child victims are likely to run away and receive care intermittently. Unfortunately, government funding is essential still to the survival of many programs, but shelter and service providers must establish measurable indicators that are realistic and quantifiable to demonstrate good stewardship of investments. Very important that they're both sides, that there be a flow of funds, but that the service providers be able to step up and be able to say why their program is actually being effective. Programmatic and therapeutic responses. Victims of child sex trafficking require individualized treatment plans, as each case is unique. Trauma-informed, strength-based care is key. It includes understanding the history of abuse and the role that violence has played in the life of the youth. All staff and volunteers should understand the complex trauma associated with sex trafficking and provide programming nurturing the strengths of each individual client. Service providers must take care not to re-traumatize the youth or replicate the power hierarchy of the trafficking situation from which the survivor has been removed. It's really interesting to read the report to learn more about those specific aspects. Treatment plans should be designed to lead to self-sufficiency, identifying services that will allow the youth to heal while transitioning towards independence. Safety and security recommendations. Providers must be able to respond to internal security risks. Victims are often high flight risks, have the potential for self-harm, or can harm others through internal recruitment. Staff must be trained to recognize and de-escalate behaviors. Law enforcement should be aware of programs, operations, and be available if emergency situations arrive. So that's an overview of the recommendations. Let me just talk about federal implications for a couple minutes. We hope that the results of the colloquium and the recommendations in the report are used by policymakers and legislators as guidelines for where we move next, and in our government's response to ensure that every commercially sexually exploited child is identified and given the best chance possible at recovering and living a whole and enriched life. That's the whole purpose of this report, for us to take it and translate it into how we do a better job. These young people have some horrific histories, life histories of abuse and neglect and physical and emotional violence. And we can't have kids in the United States who've been through that and that we then just ignore. The recommendations in the report that resulted from this year-long consultation among experts should really provide the basis for future federal law and policy for shelter and services for these young people. Two bills that have been introduced in Congress align with many of the report recommendations. I just want to highlight those right now. The Child Sex Trafficking Data and Response Act of 2013, sponsored by Senators Kirk, Wyden, and Portman, and co-sponsored by Senators Blumenthal, Sherrod Brown, and Cantwell. This legislation improves state and national data on the scope and prevalence of child sex trafficking and brings reforms to the child welfare system to better identify and assist the victims. The bill encourages states to improve coordination between child welfare, juvenile justice, and social service agencies to address the unique needs of these kids, including placements in stable housing, treatments for sexual trauma, and other measures. And then on the House side, H.R. 1732, strengthening the Child Welfare Response to Human Trafficking Act of 2013, sponsored by Karen Bass. Specific strategies to identify victims, manage cases, and improve services to meet the unique needs of foster youth who are also victims of trafficking or at risk. Additional federal policy considerations, just quickly, have to do with ensuring minimum standards of care for sexually exploited youth, ensuring that there is a continuum of care that meets their myriad needs, ensuring collaboration and coordination, and funding. So, ensuring minimum standards, recognizing the unique needs of child victims of trafficking, we urge policymakers to prioritize the development of standards of care for trafficked youth. Continuum of care involves integrating a system of care that guides and tracks survivors of commercial sexual exploitation through their varying needs they have over time with varying levels of intensity. We urge policymakers to create a model for how this looks for minor victims of trafficking in the United States, and I'm hopeful that what Catherine Chan was talking about will emerge with those kinds of models. Collaboration is key. Since no agency can tackle this alone, developing guidelines that increase communication between service providers and agencies will benefit the restorative process. And finally, funding. We have to continue to provide and must go on to expand funding for programs to be able to carry out their high-quality treatment plans. There are ways to use existing dollars to improve the response. It doesn't always necessarily mean just sending in more dollars, more total funding. And I'll use the example of foster care. Specialized foster care programs to treat sexually exploited kids. Foster care programs exist in every state already. Specialized foster care calls for doing additional training for some foster care families so that they are willing and able to handle sexually exploited kids who have been through so much violence in their lives. I was going to talk about what Catherine Chan just talked about, so I'm going to not talk about the Department of Health and Human Services guidance and their strategic action plan. I'm glad that they're on the case, let's just put it that way. Finally, two quick things. I want to just talk about the unique needs of boys as survivors of sex trafficking as the issue of boys is finally starting to percolate up to the head of the priority list. Over the years that I've been doing work on advocacy for children, there have been times when it seemed like policy and legislation was focused on boys, and that girls were kind of seen as an aberrant form of boys, but, you know, girls were there too. I feel a little bit on the sex trafficking world that we have put a lot of focus talking about the needs of sexually exploited girls, but that the needs of sexually exploited boys should be just as high a priority, and that it might look different and it might act different, but they are just as much as need of protection and assistance as any girl is. And finally, The U.S. government has ratified the optional protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. The UN committee, which meets in Geneva, just reviewed how the U.S. is doing in implementing that optional protocol, and it gave a long list of recommendations that it gives to governments about how the international experts say that we could do a better job. And one of the recommendations has to do with providing shelter and services for sexually exploited youth. The reason I mention it is that the U.S. does make a lot of commitments at the international level for what it says it will do and how well it is doing at certain things. And I'm just here to tell you that they're saying those things in Geneva and New York at the UN or international fora, and it's really up for us advocates like Shared Hope and ECPAT and Protection Project to make sure that those things happen. And I think that this colloquium report moves us very far along in meeting the standards that the US says it holds up and wants to make sure it holds up. And so I recommend the report to you and translating it into action afterwards. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Carol. Next, it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Mohammed Mattar, Executive Director, the Protection Project at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has literally flown across the world to be here with us today, and we are so grateful for their partnership and leadership.
Thank you. Thank you, Eliza. Let me start with a word of appreciation to Shared Hope International and a recognition of the work of Congresswoman Linda Smith. This report is basically another great accomplishment of Shared Hope International and the president of Shared Hope International. So, Brooke Robinson, you made the right choice. Brooke came to us looking for an internship in Washington, D.C. Yes. And she decided to intern with Shared Hope International and not the Protection Project. So you made the right choice. In fact, my own son, whose name is mentioned in this report, was an intern working with you. So I really have a lot to be thankful for. Yes. And Linda gave me very generous. She told me you have 5 minutes. And limited my role to basically to talk about the law, because she knows I know nothing but the law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That really covers both domestic victims of sex trafficking as well as international victims. In fact, when TVPA was adopted back in October 28, 2000, it only covered international trafficking. So I think this report reflects a new development in the law in this country, and that is we are paying attention to domestic victims as well as international victims. I'm going to talk about both very quickly. And the report tells it all, as was described by my good friend Carla of ECPAT. And it includes many findings. One is that there's still lack of services and shelters, appropriate shelters, for domestic minor sex trafficking victims. When you read the report, you get the sense, well, something has been done, but still a lot to be done. These findings of the report that I read again on the plane last night are supported by the TIP report. The TIP report was just released a few days ago, and now it has 20 countries on Tier 3, yes, including Russia and China, thank God. Yeah, that they moved them from Tier 2 watch list at last. I see you smiling, so that's good news. And the report clearly states that in the United States, trafficked victims are still treated as criminal offenders. Basically, this is something that you see in the international Shared Hope International report, and you see it also in the TIP report. And that is why it is really important to have what we call safe harbor laws. In this country, 14 states have adopted such laws recognizing children involved in prostitution, not as criminals, but as victims. So we want to push for more states to adopt these kinds of laws, the safe harbor laws. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as you all know, was amended 4 times. It is now 122 pages long. And that's why if you want to follow the development of the law, all you have to do, and allow me to do that, is to take a look at the Protection Project website. We have the TVPA in 5 colors: black, red, blue, green, and purple. So you choose your color, but it helps you understand how there was a shift in the law from international trafficking to domestic trafficking. Prohibiting charging or prosecuting a child who is involved in a prostitution offense, and requiring a referral to the appropriate service providers. So the TVPA was amended to treat a child victim as a victim and not as a criminal, and this is really what the report tells us. TVPA also enhanced the prosecution of those offenders, those who exploit our children, and you see that throughout the development of the law. The Act defines a minor victim of sex trafficking as a person who is less than 20 years of age, and a minor shall not be required to collaborate with law enforcement officials to have access to residential care or other services. That's a good development in the law. Also not required is any proof of force, fraud, or coercion. Trafficking in children is trafficking per se. And now the government is not also required to prove that the defendant knew that the person who is subject to sex trafficking had not attained the age of 18 years. And if the offender is convicted of a crime of sex tourism, we're not going to let him leave the country. The Secretary of State now has the authority not to issue a passport for somebody who is convicted of 24, 23, the child sex tourism offense. But I read the TVPA in a different way. When you take a look at the version of 2000, the focus was on the concept itself, the child victim. When you read the TVPA in 2003, 5, 8, and 13, there is a shift to protection of special groups of children. You see that for in what the TVPA calls unaccompanied alien children. Sections devoted for protection of unaccompanied alien children to be placed in safe and secure placement in the least restrictive setting that is in the best interest of the child. You see that in the concept of child soldier that was introduced. Also, you see that in incorporating anti-trafficking policies for children in conflict and emergency situations. You see that in preventing child trafficking through child marriage. And you see that in the concept of child labor. We all talk about the TIP report. I'd like to mention the Labor Department report, 2012. It has a list of goods that are produced through child labor and forced labor. basically 134 goods in 74 countries, exploiting children in producing diamond and gold and cotton and fish and rice, you name it. So this is how I see the shift in the law, focusing on special groups of children that require special attention, and I think including the domestic victims of sex trafficking. Let me conclude. Now I am 5 minutes, okay. Let me conclude by mentioning something that was added in 2013 to the TVPA, and that is what is called the Child Protection Compacts. A new concept, partnership between the United States and countries that initiate policies that reduce trafficking of minors. And I am quoting the act, building sustainable and effective systems of justice, prosecution, and protection. So, a base of knowledge, you described the report. I suggest that we share this base of knowledge as our first initiative to be part of what the TVPA 2013 calls Child Protection Compacts. I think in every country around the world, we need sustainable and effective systems of justice, prosecution, and protection. And I think the report can serve as providing best practices from the US and let us share this base of knowledge with the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matar. And I'm not going to have to be on my tiptoes anymore because I'm actually going to join our panel over here. I have to say, I am so excited about not just the experience represented here today and the leadership represented here today, but just the caliber of expertise represented on this panel. Each of these individuals truly represents not just recommendations and lessons learned from this report, but the, in the trenches work that's happening on the ground and can really truly speak to what these needs look like. I'm going to quickly just say who each and every one of us are, and then do a further bio as I ask each individual question. First, I think that in my rush to start today, I might have forgotten to say that I'm Eliza Riak. I'm Director of Programs at Shared Hope International. And to my right is my good friend Dale Alton, Executive Director of the Georgia Care Connection, based in Atlanta, Georgia. Also from Georgia, my hometown of Marietta, Georgia, if mom and dad are watching. We have survivor advocate and tremendous leader, Mark Taylor. Next to Mark is acting director of the Office of Victims of Crime and newly appointed by President Obama, or nominated, sorry, I've got to get my lingo right, as to be the director of the Office of Victims of Crime at the Department of Justice. Next to Joy is Dr. Courtney Gaskins, Director of Programs. I have to have my notes in front of me, at Youth for Tomorrow in Virginia. And finally, fresh off the plane from California, I think she ran right in the door of the Capitol, Thelma T. Ortiz Walker Pettigrew, also survivor advocate and board director at the Human Rights Project for Girls here in Washington, D.C. So, first, I'd like to direct to you, Mark. As I said, Mark is a brave advocate in the fight against domestic minor sex trafficking. He is actively involved in mobilizing his church in Marietta, Georgia, where he serves as youth director and is actively addressing this issue in particular. He shares his own story of victimization to educate others about this horrific crime. Today, Mark has made the journey from victim to survivor advocate. He participates in the Georgia Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, and he also collaborates with several national organizations providing leadership and survivor perspective in the effort to protect our country from sex trafficking. So Mark, you certainly have adamantly expressed the need for adequate shelter directly targeted towards boys. Being a survivor yourself, what was your experience with shelter and services? Were there any available at the time?
Thank you, Eliza. At that time, no. No services, no shelters, no areas of concern or concentration that I can go to at that particular time. When I needed the support, needed the help at the time, I kind of closed in a little bit, held it in a little bit, and then certain areas that I was able to enter into allowed me to kind of deal with this particular situation.
Maybe I should bring this mic down. As a follow-up, do you think that it's important for these gender-specific programs to be developed, and what do you think those should look like?
I do. I think it should be gender specific simply because me as a male and looking at other males, we don't talk. We don't say anything. We kind of be hard up. The gang type. Somebody bothered me, somebody touched me, somebody got me being in prostitution, things like that. We're not going to talk about it. So if it's more gender specific for them, they have someone that they can talk to. They can talk to someone in confidence. They can talk to someone that's going to help them. They can talk to someone that's going to help put services in place for them. They can also have a friend. And I say a friend simply because if you can't talk to mom, you can't talk to dad, brother, sister, you got somebody that you can talk to. Someone that's been there, someone that's dealt with it, someone that's been able to overcome, and also someone that can help them build from where they are to become someone that they want to be.
Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate your bravery and being here today and your leadership on this issue.
You're welcome.
Next, I'd like to speak to Dale Alton. Dale has been the director of the Georgia Care Connection since 2009. Georgia Care Connection is an initiative of the Governor's Office for Children and Families to identify and coordinate services for victims of commercial sexual exploitation, child victims. Georgia Care Connection provides statewide independent care coordination for CSEC youth, utilizing the system of care approach the GCCO team developed, and sets these youth in a new direction for their lives. Dale is responsible for fostering strategic partnerships, securing and overseeing funding streams, and heightening awareness of CSEC in Georgia. Previously, as the executive director for Stand Up Kids in Atlanta, Dale serviced and accompanied homeless youth ages 21 and under through street outreach and a walk-in center, which was open 2 nights a week. Dale was founding member of the Homeless Youth Council for the Regional Commission of Homelessness. She has held membership positions with the Homelessness Council, Health Council of Atlanta-Fulton County Connections, and the Homeless Action Group. Presently, Dale is a member of the Governor's Office for Children and Families CSEC Task Force, and she chairs the Youth Recovering and Thriving Work Group, participates in other task force work groups, as well as in many other partner and community meetings. Dale graduated from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Emory University Law School. So that is quite an extensive area of expertise and probably a huge reason why the Georgia Care Connection continues to be the central hub of referrals and then for placement of CSEC youth, receiving referrals from law enforcement, from child welfare, and from the community across the state. A huge part of the Colloquium report talks about challenges to placement when you're talking about a huge group of kids with different stories and different needs, but this one shared and very complex trauma. Dale, can you talk about both the successes and some of the challenges Georgia Care Connection has seen in their establishment, especially in regards to placement?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Shared Hope, NECPCAT, and the Protection Project for the work they've done on this. And it's been an honor to be a part of it, and I've learned so much through the process, meeting everyone who is involved in this. And I think the work going forward is going to really help us all. I think the recommendations are excellent and a really good basis for what we're talking about here today. In the report, it mentioned that programs should be developed in a way that the victim sees the program as a place of refuge, healing, and somewhere they want to go. And I think that is really important in the work we try to do. It also mentions that strength-based approach is so important, and I think that's a good recommendation to go forward. And that you nurture the strengths of the children so that they can see a different life for themselves. And that's what we try to do at Georgia Care Connection. We use a team approach. We're fortunate to have 2 survivors on staff who are intervention specialists who we connect with every single youth, CSEC youth that comes through our doors. And we have a family support specialist who also was a guardian for a youth in another state 20 years ago and helped that child get through the process as a victim. And then we have our 2 CSEC service coordinators on staff, and they're a team, so when a referral comes in, and you're right, they come in from a dozen different sources now, children will call us up and report themselves and ask for help, which is wonderful. Family members will, law enforcement will, our mental health providers know us now, as well as the Child Welfare, Department of Juvenile Justice, and other organizations. So what we do is do a screening and then figure out as a team approach, a collective effort here of what is the best way placement for this child. And we do have an array of placements. We're fortunate enough to be building that continuum of care that we all want. It's not quite where we all want it yet, but we're getting there. We have an emergency beds that we can do, and we've done several times when law enforcement asks the question, what do we do on a Saturday night when we find a child? We're building a process for that, where they can call 24 hours a day and take them to our children's hospital and get them the care they need. And from that point, call in Department of Family Children Services and other members that need to be part of the process of getting them into an emergency bed. So no longer do children have to be going to detention if they don't have a warrant out for something else that they need to be going for. So we're grateful for that. The challenges in the placement, we do have a safe home with wonderful work that they do, but not every child is a good fit for that placement. We need places for our lower IQ children. We need places for a higher level of care they may need at that point. And we are building those relationships with some of the residential treatment centers, psychiatric residential treatment centers. And children who are pregnant are not able to go into the safe home we have. So we're building relationships with other safe homes and training them about CSEC so that we have placement for those girls as well. It is an individual situation. Every child's need is different, and not everyone needs to go to a safe home. We have, most of our youth are still get worked with in the community, in their homes, and we try to build wraparound services and get them connected to mental health, trauma-informed therapy there, and wrap around a team of the intervention specialists, family support specialists, and others in the community as well. So the challenges are that every child is individual, and every child's needs are individual, and we just need to continue building that continuum of care to be able to meet those needs.
Thank you so much, Dale. We're so impressed by the leadership out of the state of Georgia and your part in that. Next, I'd like to speak to Dr. Courtney Gaskins. She has a lot of acronyms in her bio with all of the incredible things she's accomplished, so bear with me. Dr. Gaskins has been working with at-risk children and youth populations for more than 25 years. She joined Youth for Tomorrow and is now the Director of Program Services. As such, Dr. Gaskins provides oversight and guides program implementation of YFT's 4 components: residential, education, counseling, and community services. Dr. Gaskins has been an adjunct lecturer at George Mason University and Mary Washington University. Prior to joining YFT, Dr. Gaskins was a special education teacher for several public schools in Virginia and a youth development special for the preceding 11 years with Virginia Tech, Virginia Cooperative Extension. While at Virginia Tech, she was the director of the Children, Youth, and Family at-Risk Initiative, assisting communities across the state in developing programs for high-risk populations such as gang prevention, IT programs, and educational initiatives. She earned her BA in psychology and PhD in education from George Mason University with a specialty in working with youth who have been emotionally and behavioral disorders. And she has a master's in education and a certificate in education leadership from the University of Washington, Mary Washington.
She's been providing training in trauma-informed care, domestic minor sex trafficking, special need population, and literacy. She is currently the co-chair for the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force Victim Service Committee, member of the Prince William County CPMT, and an appointee to the Department of Education Advisory Board for the Teacher Education and Licensure. She has published and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the GMU College of Education and Human Development Service Award in 2010. So definitely, we know she's an expert in this field, and for the past few years has forged ahead in leadership at Youth for Tomorrow for specialized programming for this particular population of youth. I think she could speak to a variety of important topics around this issue, but I was really hoping today, Courtney, that we could talk about the important part of the colloquium recommendations, which is around safety and security, both internal and external. It's important we know, especially in shelter services, that programs are prepared. So could you talk a little bit about what Youth for Tomorrow has done, specifically working with this population in relation to safety and security?
Thank you. Thanks to Shared Hope and to Linda, who have a long-term relationship, who placed a girl at our facility several years ago. Very challenging young person that I learned a lot about safety and security from. She actually consults with us now on those issues. So thank you very much. Very much appreciate being here and also talking about this issue. We kind of fell into working with the sex trafficked population, domestic minor females, based on training that we had through the Polaris Project and through Shared Hope International. And in 2008, we kind of endorsed a program called the Girls on a Journey program. And we've been well-funded. So coming from the perspective of being a well-funded program, there's a lot that you can do and consider when it comes to safety and security. Thanks to the Bowles Family Foundation, I have to give them a plug here. They're one of our biggest contributors. When it comes to safety and security, we've learned a lot of soft and hard lessons, and that has a lot to do with the things that are outlined in your report here that have to do with flight risk. One of the things that we had to deal with are girls that are at high risk of what we call AWOL, or absconding from our facility. And initially, we had a policy that stated that we would not take a child back if they absconded. And we have since changed that policy probably for the last 4 years, and with very good results from that. Part of the child's presenting issues when they come onto our campus is the need to AWOL, to get off campus, to leave. We found that when we accepted them back into the program, the length of stay was longer and longer, to the point where they settled in and were able to receive treatment. So flight risk are something that you have to deal with in this type of facility. We are an open campus. We're considered a group home, so we're not a locked down facility. We do have round-the-clock staff, at least a 1-to-6 ratio for every child on our campus. We're also a very self-contained campus, which is one of the other recommendations I would give to shelters, which are not always able to do, is that we have a accredited school on our facility. So that helps a lot when it comes to safety and security in terms of girls bringing contraband in, getting access at at a time where they shouldn't be getting access to cell phones and to the internet access, which provides a lot of issues. I'll tell you one of the best things that we did when we started this. I met with the FBI. They came on campus. Of course, they wanted to scare us away from working with this population. And one of the questions that he asked me, what are you going to do when the pimp rolls up on your campus, takes his girl and several of your other girls? We've been fortunate enough not to have that happen, but one of the things that we immediately did was establish a partnership with our local police force. We meet with them quarterly. We let them know every time a girl comes onto our facility. We do a thorough assessment. We do what we call a threat assessment. Oftentimes, the girls will talk about a fear of pimps or past people that have had control in their lives, and sometimes the threat is credible, sometimes it's not credible, but it's really important that you have that discussion and that you're very open and honest with your local police department about that. They've saved us on many occasions. We did have an incident where one of our girls' threat assessment went up extremely high. They were able to involve local FBI and other agencies to get this girl into a safe haven immediately because the threat was very credible. So that dialogue between law enforcement and your cells becomes very essential. It's also educating them that we may not have a safe harbor act here in Virginia, but when you work with your local police, they understand the issue. They understand when our girls AWOL, they may be found in a situation that involves some kind of criminal activity, but they're more likely to want to place the child back in our care as opposed to putting them in detention, unless the recommendation from us is to go into detention for their safety. The other thing that became very important were HOAs. I can give you a funny story of a girl who ran from our facility, went across the street and told the neighbors that we were abusive and beating her and that we were the traffickers. And in that instance, the HOA, when I went over and met with them following that, they were very played a strong role in helping us find the girl, get her back into our facility, also to get her the drug rehab that she needed, because of course she was in the neighborhood canvassing for substances. So that relationship that you have with your HOA, it's not to go over and tell your HOA that we have a trafficking program. It's to tell your HOA that we have a vulnerable population, that you may find them in the community, and when we do have incidences when girls have run, that we need your help in assisting in finding them. Also, shopping centers that are close to your facilities. These are the most likely places that our girls, when they do run, that's where they go. Taxi companies are very critical. When they do get access to cell phones and to the internet, they most likely are getting a taxi to come and pick them up. Yes, they don't have money, but taxi cab drivers don't always know that. But having that relationship with our local taxi cab companies and telling them that they're not allowed on our campus. The other important part to our safety and security is our staff. When we first started working with this population, over time, I've had to let about 14 staff go. Firstly, because they're not coming from this from a trauma-informed perspective. If I want to keep girls on my campus, I want to keep them safe, I have to provide active supervision in a highly structured environment. I have to keep girls busy, I have to keep them involved in things of their interest, and I have to come at this perspective with no judgment. If I have staff that are not actively supervising, then I have issues. If I have staff that are not creating that highly structured environment, then I have issues. And if I have staff that are just not treating these young people the way that they should be treated in terms of their past, bringing their past history up, it causes issues. So that becomes very important. I will say that one of the things that we are looking at strengthening is that whole concept of credible threat. And that comes from the perspective that each young girl that comes into our facility comes in different ways. It's either a pimp control situation, gang-controlled situation, familial prostitution or trafficking. And when it comes to gangs in Northern Virginia, this is an issue for us. So oftentimes we've had to deny placements because the gangs live too close to our facility and it presents a greater risk. But even in that sense, we have had young girls who are directly from our community who are gang affiliated, but because they've gone through treatment and we work within that continuum of care, stepping them back down into the community when it's safe, and also making them and helping them stay tied to the community that they grew up in as well as their family, that has become an essential means of us creating that continuum of care, working with our residential treatment facilities in the state as well as out of state, as well as our detention centers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaskins. A huge theme of the report is that challenge of keeping kids safe, but at the same time keeping an environment where they can really be empowered and thrive. And we have been so impressed by Youth for Tomorrow at their willingness to evolve and adapt and take the considerations and the child's welfare top of mind in all of their programs. Next, I'd like to address Joy Frost. Joy was designated as Acting Director of the Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, by President Barack Obama on January 20th, 2009. Previously, she served as Principal Associate Director of OVC, guiding OVC's efforts to improve services to crime victims. And as we mentioned, has recently been nominated by the President to be the Director of OVC. May I go on? Are you sure? All right. Well, so the question then, there's quite more extensive credentials to add to that. But, you know, the advocate and provider community, which we've said again and again, has just been so impressed by the federal leadership in addressing and adapting to the needs of shelter and services for victims, both through the soon-to-be finalized federal strategic action plan for shelter and services and through OVC's Vision 21 initiative. As outlined in the report, because these programs are so complex, it's often hard to communicate or measure success within a program. So what methods does OVC take for providers that you partner with to indicate or report deliverables? And do you have suggestions for other funders or grant monitors as how they should be looking at measurable indicators?
Wow. First, I want to say it's really humbling to be in the presence of my fellow panelists. OVC began funding services for human trafficking victims back in 2003. I personally started my career in the victim assistance field, working in child protective services in one of the poorest counties in the nation along the Texas-Mexico border. And sometimes I feel like I've come full circle, working with abused and neglected children from sometimes very dysfunctional families, substance abuse, untreated mental illness, poverty, and so forth. And then to see, I think, several decades later, what the results of not intervening early and effectively, the difference that makes on these children's lives. So my thanks to the three sponsors, Shared Hope, ECPAT, and the Protection Project, because one of the big challenges, not just for the human trafficking field, but something that we found out in our Vision 21 strategic planning initiative, is the dearth of data and research to really shape our programs and practices. So my kudos to you. This is adding immeasurably to our knowledge base, and that's incredibly important. I do want to say we began funding services for trafficking victims in 2003, but because of statutory restrictions, we focused on sex and labor trafficking victims who were foreign nationals. Beginning in 2009, we funded 3 demonstration projects in New York City, Chicago, and San Francisco that focused on domestic minor trafficking victims, both sex and labor, although I would say I do believe that there are domestic minor labor trafficking victims. They may be, in fact, one of the hardest populations to identify. But this was not an impact evaluation. There are so many factors that impact our ability to do an impact evaluation. The first is funding. The second, those are very expensive and long-term types of evaluations. The second is the logistics itself of doing the evaluation, and then, of course, with minor victims, with children and adolescents, that presents some pretty formidable challenges, I think, to following these victims and through the years to find out, so what difference did this particular program or intervention make? That being said, I'm not throwing up my hands and saying we can't do it. But what we have to do is slowly and methodically build that knowledge base. And we do that by collecting data. I like to say, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into taking a research and evaluation course in graduate school, and have since learned that I probably should have taken more than one course. These 3 demonstration projects, we did fund a participatory process evaluation. I think we're going to get some good data from that. The report will come out this year. They actually collected data through the end of of 2012. And I think there are some things that I can briefly throw out. I can't go into any detail. That's up to the researcher and their final report. But we know that clearly the victim population was disproportionately African American, Latino, Latina, and American Indian, Alaska Native. And I think that really supports much of the anecdotal data that we have. Ages range from 12 to 18, and about 3/4 of the clients were female. Each program also served transgendered youth. And sites that had not served males encountered great challenges with serving that population. As we've heard earlier, there are some different kinds of characteristics or presenting behavior, and the way that we intervene needs to be different as well. And the referral sources were both formal and informal: law enforcement, juvenile detention, child welfare, but also informal, such as self or friends, and street outreach. We certainly, OVC requires its grantees to provide information on client characteristics. None of it is personally identifiable, as well as services through something that we call our trafficking information management system. And I think as we get more data through the years, I think this will be useful as well. I will say the focus of our grants has never been just about funding a specific service. It's always been about building community capacity. I think someone said this earlier: none of us have the ability, the resources, and probably not the stamina to do this alone. And we need those partnerships. And I would say going beyond those informal partnerships to formal system linkages. And I really see this field as being on the cusp of making those linkages, which I think are critical. I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about the strategic action plan, but OVC is front and center in that, and it has been fascinating and actually quite rewarding to see that some of the issues that we identified in our Vision 21 strategic planning initiative have been really echoed in what we've heard on this particular services strategic action plan for human trafficking victims. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about Vision 21, you can just go to our website, which is ovc.gov, and just put in Vision 21, and it will take you to the report. And although we tried to address issues in the victims field in a very comprehensive fashion, we really did focus in on human trafficking victims in several areas. And I don't think it's coincidental when you open the Vision 21 report, which is not terribly long, it's about 55 pages, we start with a chapter on data and research. We talk about the lack of basic victimization statistics, which in turn drives funding and resources and policy and programming. And we don't have the necessary victimization stats for the victim assistance field, and we certainly don't have it for human trafficking victims, including domestic minor sex trafficking victims. I think everyone knows the FBI Uniform Crime Reports will now begin collecting data on sex and labor trafficking. That's a good start. We need to do much more. We talk about in Vision 21 about the expansion of something called NIBRS, which is the FBI's National Incidence-Based Reporting System, which gives much richer data. So I do think that in the coming years, we are going to be able to get some better statistics. Evidence-based practices, and I always say this with a bit of hesitation. Absolutely, particularly in this environment of limited resources, we need to know that our interventions work, that they're victim-centered, But this is a field that has always been driven by innovation. There's just no way about it, whether you are talking domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. So really our challenge, I think, is to address that intersection between research and practice. And we see this as a real gap. And to address this, we are doing the peer review right now. We are looking at funding eventually what we call a research to practice, but just as importantly, a practice to research translation center. And our very first step will be to do a national assessment of the role of use and research among victim assistance providers. And then we also, once we have a better understanding of where people go to use research and how they implement it in their programs, our next step will be to do this research to practice to research translation center. One final thing, or two final things. Vision 21 does continue with a focus on holistic legal assistance. And I think when you're talking about foreign national victims of trafficking, everyone recognizes the importance of legal assistance. I don't think we're quite there yet with domestic minor victims. And we are looking at a network model that really links existing legal assistance resources. They may be pro bono, they may be civil legal assistance that's funded by OVW. It could be victims' rights enforcement clinics. There are a few of them in the US that link these resources together and then address the gaps. And then finally, I talked briefly about linking systems. I think that is critical. We are not in this environment going to get a huge amount of funding to address any type of victimization. So using what we have effectively, and I know I'm basically repeating what others had said before me. And while all services have to be based on evidence, one thing that struck me, we did bring the evaluator for our 3 domestic minor trafficking projects in to kind of give us an overview of what works and what doesn't. And it was a pretty complex briefing, and when it was through, I asked the question, I said, okay, but if you had to sum it up, is there one thing that really universally, no matter what the model, that it really makes a difference? And I know it's not going to be a surprise to anybody in this room, but I think it bears reinforcing. She said it is the involvement and the continued presence of a caring, patient, non-judgmental, non-toxic adult in these kids' lives. So I just want to end we have not solved the challenge of performance measurement and impact, but we can say that we know that makes a true difference. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can all agree that someone with your extensive history in victim advocacy is great to have in leadership at OVC, and those points really should continue to be reinforced. I thought it was particularly interesting, your point about legal services. That came through loud and clear from our survivor survey, the need and desire for more structured and supported legal services. So glad to see that that's something being thought about and addressed. And now moving on to our final panelist, Wilthelma T. Ortiz Walker Pettigrew, T, is a survivor and leader and advocate. She also, after Dr. Matar, flew the farthest today to be here, so we really thank you for doing that. From the ages of 10 to 17, T survived being subjected to commercial sexual exploitation here in the United States through domestic human trafficking. T now uses her lived experiences to teach, lead, and educate on needed reforms to systems and existing services that often interface with youth who have been sexually victimized, including the child welfare, juvenile justice, and mental health systems. T has spoken at many venues, including Georgetown Law, the Tribeca Film Festival, and the U.S. Senate. She has testified before members of Congress and shared her story on a national level as one of the Glamour magazine's 2011 Women of the Year. T currently serves on the National Foster Care and Youth Alumni Policy Council and is a young woman leader and a member of the board of directors for the Human Rights Project for Girls based here in Washington, D.C. Her efforts are ongoing and continual as she recently kicked off her college campaign, T Goes to College 2013, in an article featured by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times online, and most recently was awarded the Los Angeles County Probation Department for her local and national work. And this is November. I think she's gotten a few awards since then. She also serves daily as a motivational mentor to other young people who have been similarly forced into this modern day form of slavery. So T, it goes without saying the priority you have put around survivor leadership in this issue. And as we've said already, survivor empowerment is a major theme within the report. So my question is, especially through your direct service and placement work in California, can you talk more about the importance of survivor empowerment, both directly in your services with other individuals, but also as your leadership with some of these survivor networks, like the newly formed Survivor Leadership Institute?
Can you hear me now? So first, I just want to say thank you to Shared Hope and everyone else who contributed to make this happen. I think that the report and the colloquium that was done last year is a perfect example of empowerment and leadership in regards to survivors. I think you all do great work in regards to listening and taking in survivor leadership, not just in regards to just, I guess, public forums, but in regards to really instituting the work that you do. So I want to say that. So within the work that I've done, direct services, what I've learned about empowerment has been so much. What I would say is that we use the word wraparound a lot in different ways and contexts, so I would like to use the word in a different way, wraparound empowerment. What I mean by this is we need to be able to empower survivors in multiple levels. So if it comes to the educational system, not every survivor is going to make A's and B's. It starts with small steps. It starts with passing, a test or, writing a report, something that is small. And we need to encourage and embrace and reward those things. In regards to personal lives, sometimes it's a challenge for young people to not AWOL for a certain amount of time. I know for myself in my own story, it was a personal success if I stayed in a home longer than 2 days. I think these are things that we need to encourage and empower, not just as, hurrah, yay, but more so like you took a step, you challenged yourself, and I really want to acknowledge and say that that was something that needed to be done, and that shows you how far that you can go and how much that you can do. And so I think that that's a level of encouragement we need to give. In regards to health-wise, I think that what I've learned is working direct services is that a lot of these young people who are subjected to being exploited aren't really informed or don't really have the resources to take care of themselves in regards to basic reproductive health and overall physical health. And I think that when we find, say, a youth notice something and they say, I want to get this checked out, or if they make a proactive step to go to the clinic or do something, we should be, encouraging that. We should be embracing, rewarding, being excited about those small successes. I think when we talk about empowerment, we need to talk about those small successes. I think that we all in society see success as, big money, big car, lavish lifestyle. But really, if you look at a graph of what success looks like, it looks different to each and every one of us. And success is only based and measured on what we allow it to be. And I think that we have to remember that when working with young people who have been victimized in such a way, is that the success in their lives is rated on what their perception is and what they believe success looks like. And so within talking about that, we need to talk about, programs overall, but I want to say particularly in systems such as JJC, and how we need to kind of teach them exactly, bring a empowerment ideology to these systems, such as JJC, foster care, mental health, really, rather than just putting them in detention, we need to have programs that are built within these systems. I want to say that we can develop on existing resources. I think that there's enough resources out there that there's nothing new that needs to be created. It just needs to be, collaborated. And so us to develop programs that are instituted in these systems that really look at the root causes of what is going on, what has subjected this young person to be victimized in such a way, and really focus on self-esteem. One thing that I get from working with young people is that, if they're put in detention, whether it's for their safety or whether it's for whatever reasoning, they're not learning, they're not growing, they're not getting anything out of that experience except for being locked in a cage like a kettle and like a dog, And we have to understand that these young people come to us already with so much trauma. They already come with layers of trauma that we can't even begin to imagine. And so being locked up isn't really going to do anything. It's not going to help you. And so if we're going to have that, we need to institute programs to encourage, empower self-discovery, self-esteem, small successes within a personal life. I think we also need to recognize the culture of both genders, but understand that there's a culture and a way of lifestyle and a perception of life that comes with just this experience. So we need to help empower the young people to understand that there's things that you can learn from your former life that you can bring into a new life. So I know when I spoke to some young people before, I talk about how although, I went through a lot of things to make sure that, in the life, things had to be on time, certain. I actually got to integrate that into my new life and how it made me so, real life, day-to-day practical about being, having good time management and things like that. And how, really changing things that were once maybe negative or maybe not seen as the best, or just practices that was developed in that life that can be integrated into the new lifestyle and the positive transition. Also, allowing the youth to decide within their own self, what parts of this culture do you think that you can release because you are safe now? So that can mean even in regards to their dialogue, the language that they use, the way that they speak, their tone, decisions that they make, things of that sort. So allowing them to have the power, which leads me to another point is encourage other talents and opportunities for control and decision making. The thing about it is that these young people are used to their lives being controlled, like they have no options. Their day-to-day lives are based on in the hands and the mercy of another person. And so really encourage other talents. Not every survivor is meant to tell their story. So if I'm going to say one thing to empower survivors, I will say that not every survivor is meant to tell their story. And the fact that when people find out that a young person has an experience and they don't just relish on that, but they relish on the other talents that are hidden beneath that, hidden beneath the hurt, the pain, the trauma, the yelling, the cussing. That's when young people can learn, how do I learn to take control? Little baby steps in my life. How to not answer the phone for everybody who calls me. How to be able to say, I can use the off button, or, my body can't take, going on this walk, so I need to rest. So small controls, opportunities for control and decision making. So again, not every survivor is meant to tell their story. Allow them to be exposed to other things. I want to say that one thing that I found in the work is, exposing them to multiple levels of things such as nature, different cultures, different traditions, basically trying new things that have never been done before. And trust me, survivors in the beginning might be freaking out. I mean, I remember I went with a few survivors to Yosemite and talk about chaotic. screaming, yelling bugs. But at the end of the trip, everybody felt accomplished that they were able to, you know, get out there, try something new. They faced their fears of the dark. They faced their fears in nature, and they did something different. And I think that it's really those that allow for self-discovery. And ultimately, when we talk about empowerment, that's what's going to make a difference, is young people learning about themselves and young people learning about what they're able to do. That will make a difference. So just going off of that, we need to talk about allowing young people to understand what we need to be encouraging is interdependence versus independence. See, the thing that has really, I say, added onto the mental chains and boundaries in someone's mind is this false identity of in sense of I'm going to be independent. And really, if we think about it in our day-to-day lives, we are all interdependent. We rely on our jobs to give us the financial means to go forth. We're interdependent on that. We're interdependent on people in our lives to contribute to us, to help us out in certain situations. You know, you might have somebody that you call if you have a financial situation. You might have someone you call if you have an emotional situation. So when we empower survivors, we need to empower the idea of interdependence rather than independence. Also, I want to talk from a health perspective. Therapeutic services, I think one thing that is important in empowerment overall is options and choices. And so we really want to talk about, you know, allowing them to embrace therapy as a different type of form rather than just sitting in the chair with the aquarium and tell me your story. What about looking into alternatives like life coaches? It makes it more interesting. It makes it more like savvy. I got a life coach. Look into art therapy, things of that sort. And settings, one thing that was mentioned in the report that I think is really important is we talk about different settings and allowing them to have that. And so I think that I want to embrace and encourage options and the availability to do that. Building a community outside of our programs. I think that that's something that if we want to talk about empowerment, we need to empower these young people to be more than their story and more than the systems and the programs that confine them to that. And so what I mean by that is encouraging them to build community within their schools, within family friends, within religious practices if they have a person that they draw to in the church community, things like that. So empowering that. Healthy relationships, I think that we need to talk about these young people don't really have a clear sense of what healthy relationships looks like. So we need to be able to educate them more on that. I think that one thing that I've learned with working with young people is acknowledging similarities of domestic violence and sexual assault victims. It just makes it more empowering to know that just because I've had this one experience doesn't mean I'm much different than many other people in the world, and it just makes me feel more of a person. I know my time is getting cut short, so I just want to say, empowering them to learn about themselves as far as the visceral reactions that they have. These are things that are going to go on. I can say that I, at the age of 23, going on 24, have reactions sometimes, and I feel like I'm a terrible person, and I have to have people around me that encourage and tell me, no, those are reactions and responses because of the things that happen to you and not because of who you are. You are not a bad person. And lastly, just avoid labels. I know that we're all in this in regards to changing the way young people have opportunities in life and the way that they are accepted into society, but changing labels in regards to avoiding, I know in our work, this is something that's often used, but avoiding young people being used as a term as prostituted or prostitutes when they're not even oftentimes legal age to consent to sex, so they can't be selling something that they don't have the legal right to have. So avoiding labels, there's so much else I want to say, but I know time's cut short. So thank you so much.
T, we really appreciate you taking that extra time, and to everybody. We are going to allow time for questions, but before we do, I need to say that we are past our 2:30 mark, so I want to give the folks that need to go or have scheduled to leave the opportunity to do so now. But we did, especially for all of those watching on the Twitter feed, again, hashtag DMSTR. and those of you in the audience who would like to stick around, an opportunity to ask a few questions of our very knowledgeable panelists. And also, on that note, because we've had a little issue with our wireless mic, I'm going to ask those questions be brief, not only because of time, but also because I'm going to have to repeat them and remember what you said. so I'd appreciate that piece as well. So do we have questions in the audience? Okay, we feel very technology savvy because we have some questions coming from Twitter. Samantha, do you want to come ahead on up? Sure. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Samantha Vardaman with Shared Hope International, and we have been online with this event, and so we had some questions submitted via Twitter. And I'll ask two questions of the panel, and unfortunately, we're losing Joy. No, that's fine. Thank you. But I think that the ones on the panel here are perfect to answer these two questions. The first question is related to foster care, and it was already mentioned earlier by Carol as well, I think by Dr. Gaskins. Different children require different care. The question is, as a step-down service for a child who has been in a shelter, what services are available to foster care families to be trained to be that next step?
Well, I can speak on behalf of Virginia. There's not very much. I think we're one of those states that's getting there. We just started training our social workers in understanding the whole idea of trafficking, and the next step as a part of our task force in Northern Virginia is to train foster care parents.
Dale, did you have anything to add from your experience in Georgia?
Georgia's working on it as well, and it needs to be an added training on top of the basic foster care. And we hope to be there too.
I know from the perspective of the state of California, we've made some advances towards finding proper placements in regards to CSEC. And so I think that with the new reform of AB 12, which makes foster care available to the age of 21, there's new hearings that is a collaboration primarily when you have youth who have been involved with the juvenile justice system and the foster care system. They're called 241.1 hearings, and I think that that's a strong advancement in regards to just looking at the needs and concerns of these youth and finding proper placement. But we also need, families who are open and willing to open their houses to kids who are going to leave and are going to probably disrespect you, but you have to keep an open home because you will be that form of attachment that they probably never had other than their exploiter.
That's a very good point. It's also a great segue to the second question that we have, and that is what should be done to make sure that survivors of child sex trafficking continue to get shelter and services for their victimization after they turn 18?
Fortunate enough that our shelter will take young people up until they turn 21. But a lot of work goes into aftercare with our young people. I mean, I think that was one of the hard lessons that we learned is, yes, we took in a young person, but there has to be an end date for these young people. They cannot stay with us forever. We see kids regress because they've met all of the criteria that they're supposed to meet in terms of our program. They've developed, they've met our treatment plan goals for them, and then all of a sudden there's no next step because it's either unsafe to go back in that community, the family hasn't gotten themselves together yet. So a lot of what we've had to do is work better with our community partners in understanding what it takes to, once they place a child at our facility, even if it's a NGO from the community, is that you have to have a responsibility with us to ensure that we have a placement after the program. It comes kind of hand in hand when you have a placement by a probation officer or by foster care. They tend to understand that there is some aftercare and that there is an end game for young people. But when you have placements like Shared Hope, we had a young girl who just came from the community. We've had probably about 15 of those young people that are just being placed by an agency or by a law enforcement who's looking for a placement. But we've had to go into this partnership with law enforcement and with those agencies to say, you need to assist us with the aftercare. You need to help us make sure that when we send this young person home, that it's a safe environment. And so it's been we've had to be very creative. We've had families step forward and offer respite. To the point where they've ended up keeping young people probably longer than what they should have. But those are the types of things that you have to take into consideration before you even allow that person to come into your shelter or come into your care.
In Georgia, we've been building our continuum of care, and we have partners who've come to the table who have a program called Empowerment Living Program specific for CSEC girls who are 17 to 21, as well as 2 partners that serve 18 and over women with shelter.
Mark, did you want to add to that?
I do. I think what needs to take place also with that, it needs to be more gender specific. I look at the male population. At the time when I went through what I went through, there was nothing there. There was no aftercare. There was no support. The only way that I found support was when I joined a group called the Wisconsin State Youth Choir. And that was my outlet. That was my aftercare. Every time they traveled, I was with them. I had a luggage. Let's go, let's travel. Because that was the aftercare for me. So we need to be more gender specific with them, simply because there may not be a choir. There may not be a person. But if the aftercare is there to where I can reach out and say, hey, I need to talk, or hey, I need to, I'm dealing with something, or an issue just rolls up, or I saw somebody that bothered me 20 years ago, what can I do about it? So it needs to be more gender specific for us.
Definitely. I just want to say that I agree with Mark 100%. I definitely also want to say that when we talk about gender specific, I also want to talk about us acknowledging, especially with the changes in the United States, transgender as its own gender as well, because I have worked with multiple youth who identify as transgender, whether that's one way or another. I know that when I think about aftercare, I think that this is where I talk about the empowerment of building community is so important, because I think it's so much in regards to how I think Dr. Gassens gives a perfect example of how many times young people can become dependent, or, not really have a roadmap of the next place to go. And so one thing I think is that when you build community, you can work with people and in the community and young people to kind of take baby steps. So if that's getting out of the shelter to run a room, okay, that's one step. And then from running a room to a studio, that's another step. From studio to your first apartment, that's another step. So just acknowledging that with everything that we do, it is small steps and to get to the bigger picture, but also just encouraging building community, because that's what's really going to matter after the programs end.
Absolutely. Do you have more? With that, I'm going to hand it back to Eliza, and there are questions from the floor.
I see any questions? Great. I think that was actually a great way to wrap up this session, and to echo Carol's comments, really think about where do we go from here as a platform from this report. I hope you all will keep the dialogue going on Twitter after you've had a chance to read the report, again at #DMSTR. And thank you so much to our panelists who have come from all over the country to be here to speak to you. We really appreciate your time.